Welcome to this explainer. So, between 1939 and 1945, the globe was engulfed in a conflict so massive that it fundamentally redrew the map of the world and claimed over 70 million lives. Today, we're taking a structured, bird's-eye view of World War II. We're going to take a really focused look at exactly how this monumental event unfolded, who was actually involved, and what it left in its wake. If you love understanding complex history through clear structures, well, you're in exactly the right place.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. The belligerent powers. 2. Background and chronology. 3. Course of the war. 4. Turning points and victory. And finally, 5. Post-war impacts. This structural roadmap is going to guide us logically from the key players right through the timeline and into the devastating aftermath.
All right, Section 1, the belligerent powers, the opposing forces that shaped the conflict. To really understand the immense scale of this war, we absolutely have to look at the defining factions first.
The world essentially fractured into two massive alliances, the Allied powers versus the Axis powers. On one side, you have the Allied powers, which formed primarily as a defense against rising territorial aggression. They represented this enormous, disparate coalition of nations that were really drawn together out of sheer necessity to stop a common threat. And on the opposing side, you've got the Axis powers, who are bound by formal treaties and a shared pursuit of aggressive military expansion and global empire building. There is just no understanding the war without first grasping the fundamental, polarizing nature of this massive global split.
And this brilliantly illustrates who was actually at the helm of these huge coalitions, literally dictating the fate of millions. For the Allies, you had vastly different ideologies, uniting purely out of necessity. We're talking Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek. Capitalists, communists, and imperialists, all setting aside their deep-seated differences just to survive. And they faced an Axis leadership driven by extreme nationalist and totalitarian visions, spearheaded by German Chancellor Adolf Hitler, Japanese Emperor Hirohito, and Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. These specific individuals were the ones directing the grand strategies that defined an entire era of human history.
Moving right along to Section 2, Background and Chronology. Setting the stage for global war, because a conflict of this unimaginable scale simply doesn't happen overnight, right?
Let's define the chronology here as the historical categorization and timing of the background events that led to global conflict. The timeline to war was basically a careful stacking of dominoes. You had unresolved tensions and incredibly heavy economic burdens from World War I, largely tied to the harsh conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. This created a deeply unstable global environment. And out of that desperation came the aggressive rise of fascist regimes in Europe, who were eager to reclaim lost glory and territory. Add to that consecutive diplomatic failures, like the absolute collapse of the League of Nations when it came to enforcing international peace, and you can clearly see how these events just piled up over decades before the ultimate global conflict was finally triggered.
Let's move to Section 3, Course of the War, the trajectory of global combat. Let's see how this all builds up.
We can trace the trajectory of the conflict through 6 distinct phases. Phase 1 is the war outbreak in 1939 following the invasion of Poland. This rapidly escalated into Phase 2, the Axis advance, where Axis forces used terrifyingly swift blitzkrieg tactics to sweep across Western Europe and push deep into Soviet territory. Then, Phase 3 is the global spread, pulling in nations worldwide, especially after the attack on Pearl Harbor expanded the theater all the way across the Pacific. This led to Phase 4, the turning points, where that seemingly invincible Axis war machine was finally halted. That allowed for Phase 5, the Allied advance, pushing back across multiple fronts, which ultimately culminated in Phase 6, the total, devastating Axis collapse.
Now for Section 4, Turning Points and Victory, the shift in momentum. Let's zero in on exactly how that momentum drastically shifted away from the Axis advance.
The path to victory certainly wasn't a straight line. Step 1, the turning point of the war. These were pivotal bloody clashes like the freezing siege of Stalingrad in the east and the naval battle of Midway in the Pacific that literally stopped the Axis momentum dead in its tracks. Step 2, Allies established ground. They firmly halted years of continuous, demoralizing losses. This stabilization paved the way for Step 3, Allies advance. Think of monumental logistical pushes like the D-Day invasion of Normandy and the island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific. And finally, Step 4, Axis collapse and Allied victory. That overwhelming multi-front pressure just completely fractured the opposing alliances.
But when the guns finally fell silent on the battlefield, what impacts did the war leave behind? The story doesn't just end with a military victory. We have to look at the profound, devastating aftermath that forever changed the globe.
Which brings us to Section 5, Post-War Impacts, the legacy of a shattered world. It's incredibly heavy, but examining these grave consequences is absolutely vital for a complete understanding of what the 20th century became.
Now, what's really striking about this is the severe human cost. It wasn't just the millions of soldiers lost in brutal combat. The world uncovered horrors on a previously unimaginable scale. We're talking systemic war crimes, the targeted industrial genocide of the Holocaust, and the widespread use of concentration camps and slave labor across continents. It left an indelible, dark scar on human history. The sheer scale of civilian suffering actually reshaped how humanity views the rules of war, leading directly to modern concepts of international human rights.
Beyond the staggering human toll, the sheer desperation of the conflict forced radical societal and technological shifts. On the home front and in industry, economies were entirely restructured for total war, pulling millions of women into industrial labor for the first time, and permanently shifting workforce demographics. Meanwhile, life in occupied territories was fundamentally altered under martial law and resistance movements. And technologically, the race for supremacy birthed entirely new technological developments and warfare styles, from the deployment of radar and jet engines to medical advancements in penicillin and ultimately the terrifying dawn of the atomic age. These forced innovations permanently accelerated the modern world we live in today.
So the crucial point is this: we are looking at a completely transformed world. Understanding a conflict of this magnitude requires us to look at both the mechanics of the war itself and the permanently altered world it left in its wake. We've journeyed from the core belligerents all the way to the lasting societal impacts. Which leaves us with a really compelling question. How will the echoes of this encyclopedic global conflict shape our future understanding of history? Because when you look closely at the geopolitics and technology of the modern world, those echoes are still everywhere. I encourage you to take this structured knowledge and keep exploring. Thanks for learning with me today.